I really thought that by the time I did my June reading wrap up, I'd be like filming in a meadow in the blazing sun, but it is tipping it down and I'm inside with all the lights on trying to think about how the rain is good for the plants, but this is like ideal book weather, so let me tell you what I read in June. I started the month with Salt and Honey by Candi. This is set in southern Africa during apartheid. In this book we follow Koba, a young girl from a Kalahari tribe who at the start witnesses her parents both being murdered by a group of white hunters. She's then taken by this white family and ends up sort of living with them, but not living with them. She lives on their land and over the years gets to know certain members of the family. And it was an interesting subject to read about. I haven't read a great deal about apartheid or set in apartheid, only a couple of books I think, and comparing sort of this traditional way of life that this girl has been used to and seeing how she then adapts to this way of life with the white family that's been forced on her and how she keeps some of her traditional beliefs and ways of doing things. That was all interesting. It also touches towards the end on an interracial relationship, which was completely illegal at the time, and everyone's attitudes towards that. So that was all interesting to read about. Not sure it's the best written book I could have picked up on apartheid. There was quite a lot of head hopping, so in one paragraph you'd be from one person's perspective and then with no warning you'd suddenly be following someone else on the same page, and that was quite disorienting. I think this book just needed a harsher edit. It needed another go through, tightening up the prose, and then it would have been a better book. I think there was some good stuff in here, just the writing let it down a bit. Just, as I said, just needed another round of edits, I think, just to sort out a couple of problems that annoyed me and pulled me out of the story at times. Candi, the author, is a white woman, but it does say in the back of the book that she spent time with the tribe that Koba comes from in the novel. So while her point of view in this story maybe isn't completely authentic, I am trusting that she ran everything by people that had more knowledge of it and that it is a fair representation of their beliefs and their ways of life. Then I listened to the audiobook of Weyward by Emilia Hart. This book follows 3 different women in 3 different periods of time. We have Alva in the 1600s, who is a young woman standing accused of witchcraft. We have Violet in the 1940s, who just wants to wander around outside and look at bugs and does not want to become a proper lady and get married and do all the nice things she's supposed to. And then we have Kate, our contemporary protagonist, who is fleeing an abusive relationship, running away to the cottage that has been left to her by her great aunt. These women are all connected and we follow each of their stories as they uncover secrets about themselves and about the people around them. We piece together Alva's story and how she came to be accused of witchcraft, and we follow Violet as some things go horribly in her life. She deals with a lot of terrible things, just like Kate is dealing with in the present timeline, and it all kind of tangles and comes together, and the 2 more modern characters find out things about each other and about Alva and how they're all twined together. It's witchy, it's naturey, it's about women finding out who they are and finding their strength even when the most appalling things are thrown at them, and sort of the power in realising who you're meant to be and where you come from and all the other women that you are tied to. And this is definitely one of the best books I have read so far this year. I loved each of our 3 main characters in this story. They were very distinct in their voices and the way they looked at things and the things they wanted. I loved how they each uncovered these secrets and worked out the things going on in their lives. Just to mention quickly, given that this is a story about women enduring difficult things at different times in history, it's not a fun, light-hearted witchy book. They each go through a lot, so there are mentions of some things that might not be comfortable for everyone to read. So if you are worried about the content, have a quick look before you pick it up. But if you're okay with everything that's in it, absolutely recommended. Also, maybe I'm biased, but I think I am like Violet and I just want to walk around and look at bugs and not be a proper lady. And from one of my favourite books of the year to one of the biggest disappointments, this is Seth Patrick's The Reviver. This is a book my boyfriend read years and years ago, and now that I've spent years getting him back into reading, and he has spent years listening to me talking about writing and reading and analysing books, sometimes books that he hasn't even read, I just need to share my thoughts with him as they happen. He said, I want you to read this and I want to see what you think of it. And the premise of this book is very cool. We follow Jonah Miller, who is a young man who works as a reviver. This is a forensics job in a kind of alternative world where certain people can bring dead bodies back to life very briefly after they've been killed. And Jonah's job as a reviver is to bring these people back and question them about their deaths to help work out who killed them. And that as a setup for a thriller, for a like sci-fi thriller type book is so cool. I don't normally read books that have scary looking covers, but I read the blurb of this and I was like, yes, I'm in, this sounds really interesting. But when I'd finished this book, the way I described it to my boyfriend was like, you've ordered something on Amazon and then forgotten what you ordered. And then this enormous parcel arrives a few days later and it looks really exciting. And you're like, what did I buy myself? What treat am I about to reveal? And you open it and it is full of those little foamy bits and those horrible little inflated bits of packaging, and you have to rummage through all of that and draft the complaint email you're going to write to Amazon about their unnecessary packaging and its environmental impacts, although if that's your worry, Amazon isn't great in the first place. Anyway, you get all of that out the way, you draft your angry email, and whatever you ordered is like this tiny thing in the bottom. And you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, that's what I ordered. It's cool. But it's not, it doesn't match up to the big box. That's this book. The concept was so cool and I was really excited. And in the first couple of chapters, this big dramatic thing happens. Jonah is doing a revival and the person he is speaking to says some stuff that he was not expecting and something that's never happened to him before, and it's very creepy. And it sets you up for this fast-paced, scary book where something is lurking that the dead people can see and it's coming. And the book that followed did not match that at all. What you end up with is kind of like a police procedural. A lot of it is just this man going to his job, and then there's a mystery and someone else gets involved in solving the mystery, so they become like a little duo. But it got to the point where I kind of forgot what the original mystery was, and it all just got very sort of muddy and slow and boring. And then in the last sort of third, it becomes very sci-fi. I was going into this thinking it was like a paranormal thriller. Then the middle is like police procedural mystery. Then the last third is like real wacky sci-fi stuff and suddenly ramps up again. And it was all just very weird and not great. This needed an editor who was like, Seth, my angel, I know you've come up with all this cool stuff, Do we need to know all the logistics? No. Can we swap that for something actually happening? Yes, please. I don't want to just be horribly critical about this book, but I do need to tell you my last thing that really bothered me about it. Characters that come up frequently, reoccurring throughout the story, still get referred to by their full names. Like, you do it the first couple of times, surely, and then they're just first name for the rest of the book. Because no one else has that name, and we know who they are after we've met them the first time. It even happens with the main character. There was a chapter about 2/3 of the way through that starts with like, Jonah Miller did something, and I was like, as opposed to the other Jonah, like obviously Jonah Miller. It was just a really weird quirk of his writing. I don't know why no one at any point was like, we're gonna cut all the surnames out, we don't need them. Okay, I am done complaining about the Reviver. I still enjoyed the concept. I still stand by the fact that as a premise, it's very original and very cool. I just wish he'd done his idea justice. That's all I'm going to say. Enough of this. On to a sci-fi book that I enjoyed a lot more. This is a middle grade called Our Sister Again by Sophie Cameron. This is an ARC, an advanced reader copy. If you don't know what that is, it goes out before a book is published. The publisher will send out a select number to people that they want to review the books and hype them up on social media, etc. And someone near my office clearly gets a lot of these because then they give them into the charity shop, which I don't think you're meant to do, but I pick up a lot of them. This book is about Isla, a girl who lives on a remote Scottish island with her younger sister and her mum, and a few years before they lost Isla's older sister to cancer, I think. She was sort of 15, she got very, very sick, and they lost her. They end up part of this program where a company creates AI versions of people who've died. And because Isla's family live in such a remote place with such a small population, and Second Chances, the tech company, are trialling these replicas quite quietly, and because Flora, Isla's sister, left behind such a wealth of social media data and videos, they're deemed to be an ideal candidate for having their family member brought back. So we then follow Isla as her sister is sort of returned to her, this AI version that cannot age and can't really get sick but acts and looks pretty much exactly like Flora. It's about how the other inhabitants of the island react and how it changes the family, and ultimately whether AI can replace a whole person. It's a really interesting look into the topic and done very well for a middle grade audience, I think. Sophie Cameron's writing is really beautiful, and there's a lot about family and identity and sort of what makes you who you are. Isla, the main character, is also queer, and we get to see her first romance, I think, and I love the fact that it's not a big deal that her first real crush is on a girl. It's just, that's who she likes, and we just get to see this crush play out like you would do with a girl having her first crush on a boy. There's no huge moment of like, but it's another girl. It's just all the same sort of heart squeezy, saying the wrong thing, loveliness of watching a first crush, and I thought that was all written really beautifully. I find AI quite terrifying, especially because I'm a writer and I feel like it's coming for my job at some point, but I really enjoyed this story. I thought it was tackled really well, and it worked really well with this story about grief and family and working out how to move forwards from something so traumatic. I think this would be a really great one for kids who either are dealing with grief themselves or are worried about the future of technology, anything like that. I think this would be a good choice. And then, like pretty much everyone else, I read Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This is the first book of hers I have read. I've had Babel on my TBR for ages, but I am intimidated by how long it is, which is silly because everyone talks about how good it is, so I think I just need to stop making excuses and start on that one soon. If you're watching this, you've probably watched at least 3 other videos that tell you what Yellowface is about, but just in case you've missed it, we follow a writer named June who is sort of trying to have a career as an author. She's had some things published, but it's not the grand career she dreamed of. Meanwhile, her friend Athena is having this amazing career and doing all the things June wanted, achieving all these milestones that June thought she would have. And then one day, this isn't a spoiler, it happens right near the start, it's like the whole setup of the book, Athena dies in an accident and June is there when it happens. And this is in Athena's flat, and June decides that now is the time to have a snoop, and she comes across the manuscript for Athena's next novel. And because we quickly learn that June is not a good person, she takes the manuscript and she edits it and finishes it herself and publishes it as though she wrote the whole thing. But this is a story about Chinese labourers in World War I. Athena was an Asian woman, June very much a white lady. So she publishes the book under the name Juniper Song and kind of lets people make of that what they will. And to begin with, it looks like this shady decision is working very, very well for June, and she is finally going to have the recognition and the success that she thinks she deserves. But it doesn't stay going well for her, and I can't say more than that. But it is a sort of dark, satirical look at publishing and racism within the publishing industry and who deserves to be successful and who has the right to tell certain stories. And a lot of it is June feeling very justified in these morally very questionable things that she is doing. I think this is one of the best written unlikable characters because she's so compelling. Other books I've read where there's a horrible main character I just don't want to carry on reading. I'm like, I don't like you, no thank you. But just watching how June justifies all these things to herself, and it's like, well, why shouldn't I? Why shouldn't I take this success? Why shouldn't I be able to tell this story, do this thing, screw over this person, lie about this? Yeah, she's not nice, but she is fascinating to read. I work in publishing, so a lot of this, there are a lot of little references that I enjoyed that are things either from the sort of the reader's perspective or from within the publishing industry. And I was thinking, I don't know how enjoyable that will be to people if you're not in publishing, but based on the reviews this is getting, I guess that kind of doesn't matter if it's told well. And it does do a very neat job of showing that publishing is not as glamorous as a lot of people think, and there's a lot more chaos going on behind the scenes. I will say, I thought the climax of this book was weirdly unrealistic. The rest of it, you'd hope it wouldn't happen, but it's not unbelievable that it would. June is terrible, but she's making all these potentially very possible decisions. And then we get to the big moment where everything June has done and lied about and all the choices she's made all end up with her in this situation. And I just thought it was really over the top. I just couldn't see it happening. And I found that quite disappointing. I'd been loving the book and how sort of over the top but real it was, if that makes sense. It was this kind of warped, exaggerated version of the real industry, and some of the real people within it. And then this thing happened and I was like, no one would do that. That wouldn't happen. And I just don't know if it was necessary, but maybe I'm in the minority on that. I feel like there were other ways everything she'd done could have led to a big kind of crash. Don't know, unsure. I just got to it and was like, oh, odd. But writing, brilliant. Parts of it were very funny. Maybe not as funny overall as I was expecting, but the bits that were funny were very funny. Yes. Need to read more of her books. I need to catch up. Then I jumped from one of the most recent, most talked about releases to a book published in 1872, and that is Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. And this is like the OG vampire story. If you look it up anywhere, everything makes a big point of the fact that it was written 26 years before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. And it's really interesting. I read Dracula years ago and really enjoyed it. If you haven't read Dracula, read Dracula. Seeing how this must have influenced it. Dracula is so well known, but a lot of the features that we kind of assume are universal in a vampire story come up in Carmilla. We follow a young woman named Laura. I think she's possibly a teenager. She's young anyway. She lives in a castle in Austria with her father. And one day there is a commotion outside and a carriage pulls up and there is another young girl and her mother. And through this confusing conversation, the mother is like, my daughter is sick. I have somewhere very important to be, but I need to go now. And they're like, oh, well, she can stay with us then. And she's like, oh no, I couldn't possibly, that would be too much to ask of you, as she's getting back in her carriage. And so they end up with this strange young woman coming to stay with them for several months, I think. And the weird thing about this is that this girl, who they have never met before, Laura dreamt about years ago. She has seen this face before. This girl appeared at her bedside in a dream. And the girl says the same thing about her. So they kind of know each other, but they know they've never met. And this woman introduces herself as Carmilla. And she's like, don't ask me anything about myself, but we can be friends. And she's beautiful and she's mysterious. And Laura is completely taken with her immediately. They become very good friends. Very, very good friends. Very special friends. This is thought of as like the original sexy vampire story. And I'd heard that and I thought it was just sort of undertones or the way it was written. But no, this is quite explicitly gay. There's not anything super like raunchy going on. But these two women are very much into each other and quite physical. And that was a surprise for like the 1870s. I wasn't expecting that. They are very intense with each other. But it's not all intense looks and declarations of longing. Carmilla is slightly unsettling. She sleeps through the day and sometimes they just can't find her. And Laura starts having nightmares about creatures in her room. And then a lot of the women in the nearby village start getting sick and dying. And so begins the vampire-y part of the story. Being written in the 1870s, it has got that very particular narrative style. Some of the language is quite convoluted and I had to listen to certain bits again to work out what was going on. It's not massively fast-paced, there's not super drama all the time, and there's not much in the way of character development. I will say Laura is much the same at the end, even after the things she's been through and the things she's discovered. So if you want a really like character-driven, exciting story, there are probably modern vampire stories that do that a lot better. But if you're into that kind of story, it's really interesting just to see where all these tropes and all these elements that we associate so strongly with vampires came from. And I finished June with The Mercies by Kiran Millwood Hargrave. Most of this book takes place on a remote island. It's a remote island kind of month for me in my reading. A remote island off Norway in the 1600s. And right at the start, most of the men of the island are out fishing when this enormous storm appears very suddenly, capsizes all their boats, drowns all the men. So we're left with this island full of women. There are a couple of boys, there are a couple of old men, but it becomes an island of women. And the women have to learn how to cope without their men, how to sort of fill the roles that the men were doing, and they adapt to this new way of life, dealing with everything on their own. And after, I think about 18 months, they've settled into this new way of life. They've just started going out fishing instead of the men. They've learnt to do things on their own. They've got this new sort of social structure. And then this man arrives who has been sent to get the women in check. And he brings with him a young wife that he essentially bought on the mainland before he came over. And so we end up following Maren, a woman from the island who lost her brother and her father in the storm, and Ursa, the wife of this commissioner who's been sent to get everyone in line, bring the church back to the island, bring the women back in line and put them back where they're meant to be. And these two women come from very different backgrounds. Maren lives in a hut with her mother and her sister-in-law and her nephew, and Ursa came from a fairly well-off family, but now she's been married to this man who does not treat her very kindly. And they meet and they have this connection pretty much from the start, and a lot of the book is following this relationship as it develops into a friendship and eventually into a romance. But the other thing that's going on is that Ursa's husband has not just been sent to make sure everyone's going to church and staying in the kitchen and doing all their womanly things. This is also when the witch trials kicked off in Norway. And so ultimately this ends up being the story of how some of the women are tried as witches. It's my second witchy book of the month. It's all connected. And so we get a glimpse into the ridiculousness of the witch trials. I find it quite hard to believe that this was an actual thing that happened and that so many people believed in. And it's the fact that the women really had no way out. Once they were accused, if they confessed, they were in trouble. If they said they were innocent, they still were in trouble. Someone would find a way to make out that they were lying. They really had no chance, and it was all horrendous and stupid, and we get to see how the different people on the island react to all of this, and how some people very much get on board with it and other people are against it but really can't do much about it. And for the most part, I really enjoyed this. I love a book with witchy things going on. I liked the two main characters. I loved the descriptions of the island and its ruggedness and the isolation of it all and the daily life on the island. I think possibly it was a bit slow, especially in the middle. If you're expecting a full sapphic romance, this relationship between the two main characters is very, very slow burn. A lot of it is much more of a friendship and them sort of finding in each other the only person they can trust and that they can talk to, which I thought was done really well. But if you want a romance novel, this isn't it. It's a novel with some romance in it quite near the end. And also the witch trial stuff didn't really kick off until the second half of the book, so think the first half dealt a lot more with Ursa's struggles in her new marriage and the aftermath of the storm on the women of the island, which was interesting and I enjoyed it, but I've seen some reviews, I think possibly from people who expected a book about the witch trials, and yet that doesn't kick off until later. So I can see both sides of this. I can see why it would be frustrating if this book turned out not to be the story you went into it expecting, but I still enjoyed it. I had a nice time. I enjoyed reading it. So that was my June. Overall, if we don't talk about the Reviver ever again, I'm really pleased with the choices I made this month, and I've got some good books lined up for July, so I will see you in a month or whenever I get round to filming the next one to tell you about my July reading. In the meantime, have a good month, look after yourselves, and I'll see you soon.